FBI Captain Marcus Taylor was a man of honor and duty. His work often took him across the country, solving cases and ensuring justice for all. On this particular day, he was on a personal trip, heading to visit his family in a small, quiet town. Driving along a peaceful road lined with tall trees, Marcus couldn't have imagined that his journey would take such an unexpected turn. Marcus drove carefully, as always. He wasn't in a rush, and the hum of his car engine was almost soothing. The small town he was passing through seemed calm and ordinary, the kind of place where neighbors greeted each other warmly and life moved at a slower pace. As he approached a gas station, he decided to stop and fill up his tank before continuing on his way. The gas station was nearly empty, with only one other car parked by the convenience store. Marcus stepped out of his car, adjusted his dark blazer, and started refueling. He couldn't help but notice a police car parked nearby. The officer inside was watching him intently. At first, Marcus thought nothing of it. After all, he was just an ordinary traveler stopping for gas. But the officer's gaze lingered longer than usual, and Marcus could feel the weight of it. As Marcus got back into his car and pulled onto the road, he glanced in his rearview mirror and saw the police car following him. He remained calm, knowing he had done nothing wrong. After a few minutes, the flashing red and blue lights of the police car lit up behind him. Marcus pulled over to the side of the road, as anyone would. The officer approached his car with a stern expression. Marcus rolled down his window and greeted him politely. "Good afternoon, officer. Is there a problem?" Marcus asked, his tone calm and respectful. The officer didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked Marcus up and down before saying, "License and registration." Marcus handed over his documents without hesitation, including his FBI badge. "Here you go, officer. I'm Captain Marcus Taylor, an agent with the FBI. I'm just passing through town." The officer's eyes narrowed as he inspected the badge. "FBI, huh?" he said, his tone skeptical. "This could be fake. Step out of the car." Marcus was taken aback but remained composed. "Officer, I assure you, everything is in order. You can verify my identity by contacting the FBI office." But the officer wasn't interested in verifying anything. His expression grew more serious. "Step out of the car now." Marcus knew better than to argue. He stepped out slowly, keeping his hands visible. A second police car arrived, and another officer joined the scene. The situation felt unreal. Marcus, a man who had spent his life upholding the law, was now being treated like a suspect for reasons he couldn't understand. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the road. Marcus stood there, calm and steady, while the officers whispered to each other. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew this was just the beginning of an ordeal he'd never forget. Marcus Taylor stood calmly by his car as the two officers talked to each other in hushed tones. He could feel the tension in the air, but kept his composure. Years of working in high-pressure situations as an FBI agent had taught him how to remain calm, even when things felt unfair. Still, he couldn't shake the strange feeling that something wasn't right. One of the officers finally approached him again, holding Marcus's FBI badge in his hand. The other officer stayed back, keeping a watchful eye on him. "This badge doesn't mean anything to me," the officer said, his tone sharp. "For all I know, you printed this off the internet. You'll need to explain yourself at the station." Marcus's brows furrowed slightly. "Officer, I've given you everything you need to verify my identity. My badge number is clearly listed, and a quick call to the FBI headquarters will confirm it." But the officer didn't seem interested in making any calls. He crossed his arms and gave Marcus a long, skeptical look. "You expect me to believe that an FBI agent is driving through this town, dressed like that, and stopping at a gas station? Doesn't add up." Marcus tried to stay patient. "I'm visiting my family. This is a personal trip, not an official one. Please, check with my office. They can vouch for me." Before the officer could respond, the second officer stepped forward. his hand resting on the radio at his shoulder. Maybe he's hiding something. Let's search his car. This caught Marcus off guard. You have no reason to search my car, he said firmly, but respectfully. Everything I've done has been transparent, and I've followed your instructions. There's nothing illegal here. The officers exchanged a glance, and the first one gave a slight nod. We'll see about that. Step away from the car. Marcus sighed inwardly but complied, stepping a few feet back as the officers began searching through his vehicle. They opened the trunk, rifled through his briefcase, and even checked under the seats. Marcus stood quietly, his hands in plain sight, as they went through his belongings. Nothing here, one officer muttered after a few minutes. The first officer frowned, clearly displeased with the lack of evidence. Why don't you tell us what you're really doing here? The officer pressed, his tone accusatory. You can't expect us to believe you're just passing through. Marcus maintained his steady demeanor. With all due respect, officer, I've explained myself multiple times. I'm an FBI agent on a personal trip. If there's nothing else, I'd like to be on my way. But it wasn't enough for the officers. The tension in their expressions grew heavier. The first officer stepped closer, his voice rising slightly. You don't get to decide when this is over. We'll tell you when you can leave. The situation had gone from routine to absurd, and Marcus realized this wasn't just a misunderstanding. Something deeper was at play, and he was caught in the middle of it. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, he braced himself for what might come next. Marcus stood still, trying his best to stay calm, but he could feel his pulse quickening. The officers were still questioning him, and everything about the situation seemed off. It wasn't just about the badge anymore. It was clear they didn't believe who he was. The longer he stayed there, the more he realized that this wasn't just a misunderstanding. The first officer stepped back and motioned toward the other officer. Call for backup, he said. We need to make sure we're dealing with the right person. Marcus could see that the officers weren't backing down. His stomach tightened. He had worked in tough situations before, but this felt different. There was no reason for him to be treated like this. He was an FBI agent, doing nothing wrong, yet here he was, on the side of the road, with officers questioning his every word. As the second officer picked up his radio to call for backup, Marcus noticed another police car pulling into view. His heart sank. He had hoped this would end quickly, but now he was sure it was only going to get worse. Sir, step away from the car, the first officer ordered, his voice firm and loud. Marcus took a deep breath. He had no intention of doing anything that would escalate the situation. I'm not going anywhere until this is cleared up, he replied calmly. He kept his hands visible and stood tall, hoping the officers would understand he wasn't a threat. But things took an unexpected turn. The second officer, who had been quiet up until now, suddenly shouted, down on the ground. Now. Before Marcus could react, the officer lunged toward him, grabbing his arm. The first officer followed quickly, and Marcus found himself being forced to the ground. Everything happened in a blur. Marcus tried to keep his balance, but the officers overpowered him. Get off me, Marcus shouted, his voice filled with shock. I haven't done anything wrong. But the officers didn't listen. They continued to wrestle him onto the pavement, and that's when Marcus felt something cold and sharp press against his back. He froze. He didn't need to look to know it was a gun. The officer behind him was holding it, his grip tight on the weapon. Stay down, or I'll shoot. The officer yelled, his voice shaking with what Marcus could only assume was fear, but there was also something more, something deeper. Marcus could feel it, but he couldn't explain it. The world around him seemed to stop as he lay on the cold ground, the weight of the officer's gun pressing into his back. It was a surreal moment. He had never imagined he would find himself in a situation like this. How had it escalated so quickly? Please, Marcus said, trying to keep his voice calm. I'm FBI. Check my ID. You'll see. The officer didn't reply. He just kept the gun pressed against Marcus, his finger hovering dangerously near the trigger. Marcus could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. He knew he had to stay calm, but it was hard. Everything he had worked for, everything he stood for, was now on the line. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the moment froze. A few seconds felt like an eternity as the officer hesitated. Marcus lay there on the ground, still feeling the cold touch of the officer's gun on his back. His heart was racing, his mind spinning. He had never imagined that his simple trip to visit family would end like this. All he had tried to do was explain himself, but now he was being treated like a criminal. For what felt like an eternity, the officer kept the gun pressed against Marcus's back, not moving. Marcus held his breath, doing his best to remain calm. The second officer was still standing nearby, watching him closely, but neither of them seemed willing to listen. "Get up," the first officer finally barked. Marcus could hear the tension in the officer's voice, a mix of fear and confusion. Without waiting for a response, the officer yanked him roughly to his feet. "Why are you doing this?" Marcus asked, his voice shaking from the frustration. He was still in disbelief that something as simple as a traffic stop had spiraled into such chaos. "You're under arrest," the officer said flatly, his grip tight around Marcus's arm as he pulled him toward the police car, "for resisting arrest and impersonating a federal officer." Marcus could hardly believe what he was hearing. "What? That's not true. I've shown you everything. I'm Captain Marcus Taylor of the FBI. This is a mistake." But the officer didn't respond. He just shoved Marcus into the back seat of the police car, slamming the door behind him with a force that echoed through the quiet street. Marcus sat there in stunned silence, feeling the weight of the situation crash down on him. He had been humiliated, treated like a criminal, despite the fact that all he had done was try to go about his day. The officers had refused to listen to his explanation, and now he was being carted off to jail. For what reason? He couldn't understand. The drive to the local station felt long and endless. Marcus kept trying to reason with the officers, but each word he spoke seemed to fall on deaf ears. He tried to remind them that he was a respected FBI agent, but it didn't matter. They had made up their minds, and nothing he said would change their course. When they arrived at the station, Marcus was led into a holding cell. The cold concrete walls made everything feel more real. He was now just another person behind bars, treated like a criminal. It was hard for him to accept that this was happening. As he sat on the cold bench in the cell, his thoughts raced. He couldn't believe the officers had done this. He had worked hard for his position at the FBI, earned the trust of his colleagues, and followed the law his entire life. And yet, here he was, wrongfully arrested, his reputation now hanging in the balance. Marcus had been through many tough situations in his career, but nothing like this. He knew that getting out of this mess wasn't going to be easy, but he was determined not to let this be the end of the story. He would prove his innocence, no matter how long it took. Marcus sat in the small, cold jail cell, his back pressed against the stone wall. The dim light from a flickering bulb above him cast long shadows across the room. It was quiet, except for the distant sounds of other prisoners talking and the occasional clanging of doors. He had been sitting here for hours now, trying to make sense of everything. He had never imagined being in this position, locked up like a criminal. The officers had refused to listen, and now he was in a cell, far away from the life he knew. Marcus had seen many sides of the justice system in his career with the FBI. He had investigated criminals, helped victims, and made sure justice was served. But never before had he been on the other side. Never before had he been the one locked behind bars, treated with suspicion and disrespect. It was a harsh reality that he wasn't sure how to face. His mind kept replaying the events of the day. The traffic stop, the accusations, the gun. He couldn't understand how it had gone so wrong. All he had wanted was to pass through this town, see his family, and return home. Instead, he was caught in a mess he couldn't escape from. As he sat there, he thought about the people who depended on him, his family, his colleagues, and the community he served. How would they react when they heard about what had happened? Would they believe him when he explained what had taken place? Or would they doubt him too? But the more he thought about it, the more he realized something important. He couldn't just sit here and do nothing. He wasn't going to let this injustice go unanswered. He had worked hard for his position, and he wasn't about to let it all be taken away by a mistake, or worse, by someone's prejudice. In the cell across from him, a young man called out to him, asking if he was okay. Marcus looked over and saw a young face peering through the bars. The man had a weary look in his eyes, a look that told Marcus he'd been through a lot. "Yeah, I'm fine," Marcus replied, giving a small nod. "Just trying to figure out what's going on." The young man frowned. "They don't listen to us in here. I've been in this place too many times. They never care." Marcus knew the young man's frustration all too well. He had seen it in many people, those who felt trapped in a system that didn't seem to care about them. He had always fought for what was right, but now he was on the other side, trying to get his own voice heard. He couldn't just give up. There had to be a way out of this. Marcus knew that with patience, persistence, and the truth on his side, he could turn this situation around. But it wasn't going to be easy. As the hours passed, Marcus felt the weight of his situation pressing on him, but he also felt something else: determination. He wasn't going to let this ruin everything he had worked for. He would find a way to get out of this, and when he did, he would make sure those responsible for this injustice would answer for it. Hours had passed since Marcus was locked in the small jail cell, but to him, it felt like days. He hadn't heard much from the officers since his arrest, and the silence only made things worse. He kept telling himself that he had to stay calm, that the truth would come out soon, but it was hard to stay positive when everything felt so wrong. His mind kept racing. He had tried to explain who he was, to show them his badge, but the officers had refused to believe him. Marcus knew he had to rely on his colleagues to help him, but he couldn't help feeling helpless in the meantime. But just when he started to lose hope, the sound of footsteps outside his cell caught his attention. He quickly stood up, his heart racing. The door to his cell opened, and in walked two FBI agents, both with serious expressions on their faces. Marcus recognized them instantly: Agent Laura Harris and Agent James Reed, two of his closest colleagues. "Marcus, are you all right?" Laura asked, her voice filled with concern. Marcus let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. "I'm fine, but this isn't right. They won't listen to me. They've made up their minds." James shook his head, clearly upset. "We know. We've been working on it all night. The second we realized you were missing, we started digging. We contacted the local police department and checked everything we could." Laura stepped forward and placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "We've spoken to the higher-ups, and they're furious. We've also got people working on contacting the media. The truth is going to come out." Marcus felt a small sense of relief wash over him. His colleagues were here, and they were going to help him. For the first time since his arrest, he began to feel like there might be a way out of this nightmare. "Thank you," Marcus said quietly. "I didn't know what to do. They just kept pushing me, and I kept telling them the truth, but they didn't care." "We believe you," Laura said with a reassuring smile, "and we're going to make sure they understand who you really are." The agents quickly worked to arrange Marcus's release. They spoke to the police officers in charge, demanding that Marcus be freed immediately. The officers tried to argue, but it was clear they couldn't deny the truth any longer. After all, Marcus wasn't just any person. He was a respected FBI agent, and his colleagues were not going to let him be treated this way. It didn't take long before Marcus was led out of the holding cell. As he stepped into the light, he felt the weight of the situation lift off his shoulders, but he knew that this wasn't over yet. The damage had already been done. The officers who had wrongfully arrested him needed to be held accountable. But for now, Marcus was free. He was grateful for his colleagues and the fact that they had fought for him. As he stepped into the car, ready to return to his office and clear his name. He felt a renewed sense of determination. This was just the beginning. He would make sure that no one else would have to go through what he had experienced. Marcus sat in the car, the hum of the engine the only sound as they drove away from the small police station. His mind was still racing, trying to process everything that had happened. For hours, he had been locked in a cold cell, treated like a criminal. But now, with his colleagues by his side, he was free. Or at least, that's what he thought. As they drove through the quiet streets, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw dozens of missed calls and messages. His heart sank when he saw the news alerts flashing across the screen. The story of his arrest had already made its way onto social media, and the headlines were everywhere. FBI agent wrongfully arrested by racist cops. One headline read, FBI officer accused of impersonating officer in shocking traffic stop. Another headline screamed, human rights violation. FBI agent wrongfully detained in small town jail. Marcus stared at the screen in disbelief. It seemed impossible that something so simple had turned into a nationwide story. He hadn't expected this. The moment he had been wrongly arrested, the story had gone viral. And now, he was at the center of it all. Marcus, you okay? Laura asked from the driver's seat. She glanced at him, concern in her eyes as she noticed the look on his face. I didn't think it would get this big, Marcus said softly. I knew it wasn't right, but I didn't realize people would care this much. We're going to make sure the truth comes out, Laura reassured him. But there's a bigger issue here, Marcus. The public's perception is changing fast. This isn't just about you anymore. She was right. Marcus knew that this wasn't just about his personal struggle anymore. The media attention meant that the entire community, maybe even the entire country, was paying attention. The story wasn't just about one FBI agent getting wrongfully arrested. It was about a much larger issue of justice, fairness, and the abuse of power. Soon, the public began to take sides. Protesters gathered outside the police department where Marcus had been held, demanding justice. News anchors debated the story on television, with people sharing their own experiences of racial profiling and police misconduct. The backlash against the police officers involved was swift and powerful. While Marcus's colleagues worked behind the scenes to build a case, Marcus couldn't help but feel overwhelmed by everything that was happening. The public was watching, and the pressure was building. Yet, as Marcus watched the protests unfold on his phone, something else became clear to him. People were standing up for what was right. They were demanding accountability from the system. And it wasn't just his case. They were demanding a change for everyone who had been wronged in similar situations. Marcus knew that this was bigger than just his story. The media frenzy had sparked a much-needed conversation about race, justice, and police misconduct. People across the country were paying attention, and they weren't backing down. For the first time since the whole ordeal began, Marcus felt a glimmer of hope. Yes, his life had been turned upside down, but this was his chance to help make a difference. He wasn't just fighting for his own dignity anymore. He was part of a larger fight for justice. The days that followed Marcus's release were filled with phone calls, meetings, and constant media attention. His name was now everywhere, and people were watching to see what would happen next. The spotlight was no longer just on his wrongful arrest. It was on the larger issue of police misconduct and the treatment of individuals in the justice system. Marcus could feel the weight of it all, but he knew he had to keep moving forward. He wasn't going to let this moment pass without doing something about it. This was his chance to stand up not just for himself, but for everyone who had been treated unfairly. The injustice he had faced had sparked a wave of support, and he wasn't going to let it fade away. He spent the next few days working closely with his colleagues at the FBI to gather evidence. They started digging into the police officers involved, trying to find any information that could help hold them accountable for their actions. Marcus knew it wouldn't be easy. The officers had a lot of power, and they would fight back, but he was determined to keep going. Meanwhile, the media continued to cover the story. News outlets ran follow-up stories, interviewing witnesses who had seen the whole incident unfold. Many of them spoke out about the way Marcus had been treated. They described how the officers had acted without reason, how they had been quick to judge him based on nothing more than their own assumptions. As more people came forward with their own experiences, the pressure on the local police department grew. The public was demanding answers, and the officers involved in Marcus's arrest couldn't hide from it. The community was no longer willing to turn a blind eye to the truth. Then, one morning, Marcus received a call from one of his superiors at the FBI. "We've got the results," the voice on the other end said. "The investigation is moving forward. We got the evidence we need to press charges." A wave of relief washed over Marcus. The truth was finally coming to light. The officers who had wrongfully arrested him would have to answer for their actions. But this wasn't just about them. It was about sending a message that things had to change. That no one, no matter their position, was above the law. As the investigation unfolded, Marcus became an important voice in the conversation about police reform. He was invited to speak at rallies, share his story, and testify before lawmakers. It wasn't easy, and at times it felt like he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders, but he knew it was worth it. He worked with civil rights groups and organizations dedicated to making change. Marcus wasn't just looking for justice for himself anymore. He was fighting for a system that treated everyone equally, no matter their background. In the end, the officers who had wrongfully arrested him were held accountable. They faced disciplinary action, and the department was forced to make changes to ensure that such an incident would never happen again. Marcus's name became known, not for the injustice he had faced, but for the courage he had shown in standing up for what was right. As he looked back on everything that had happened, Marcus realized that this wasn't just a personal victory. It was a victory for anyone who had been mistreated, anyone who had been unfairly judged. And while the fight wasn't over, Marcus knew that he had made a difference. Months passed after Marcus's ordeal, and life slowly began to return to a sense of normalcy. But for Marcus, nothing would ever be the same. The events that had unfolded, the wrongful arrest, the media attention, and the fight for justice, had changed him. They had changed the way he saw the world, the way he viewed the justice system, and the way he believed change could happen. The officers who had falsely arrested him had faced consequences for their actions. They had been held accountable, and the police department had implemented new policies aimed at preventing such mistakes in the future. But Marcus knew that the work wasn't finished. The fight for fairness, for justice, didn't stop with one case. It had to be a continuous effort. Marcus's story had reached far beyond his hometown. It had inspired others who had faced similar struggles to come forward and speak up. People who had been treated unfairly, people who had been unjustly targeted, now saw that they had a voice. Marcus had become a symbol of what could happen when someone stood up for what was right, even when it seemed like the odds were stacked against them. He had spoken to large crowds, attended rallies, and met with lawmakers. He had shared his story, and in doing so, he had become a part of a larger movement for change. And though it wasn't always easy, Marcus knew that it was necessary. Every step forward, every voice raised in protest, was a victory. The road to reform was long, and there were many battles still to be fought. But Marcus believed in the power of determination. He believed that even the smallest change could lead to something bigger, and with each conversation, each meeting, he felt that hope growing stronger. One day, he stood before a group of young law enforcement officers in a training session. He spoke about what had happened to him, not as a victim, but as someone who had fought for a better future. He talked about the importance of seeing people for who they really were, not through the lens of assumptions or bias. "I didn't want to be in the spotlight," Marcus said, looking out at the faces in the room. "But sometimes, the truth has a way of shining through. And when it does, we can either turn away from it, or we can embrace it. We can choose to make things right." He could see the impact his words had on the officers in the room. Some of them nodded. Others looked deep in thought. Marcus wasn't just teaching them about laws and procedures. He was teaching them about humanity, about fairness, and about the importance of doing what's right, no matter the circumstances. As he walked out of the room later that day, Marcus felt a quiet sense of pride. He knew his journey wasn't over. There was still so much to be done. But he also knew that his story had sparked a change that would ripple out to others, inspiring them to take action, to demand better, and to stand up for justice. Marcus had faced an injustice, but in the end, he had turned that experience into something powerful. He had shown the world that change was possible, and that even in the darkest moments, there was hope. And that, he realized, was his true legacy.